Welcome back everyone to part 11 of the Sci-Fi first-person shooter tutorial series. In this video, we'll be creating our main menu for our project. We'll set this up by creating a new level and having a widget be created and added to the viewport at BeginPlay. We're also going to want to add a few buttons to the widget allowing us to quit the game or start the game from the main menu. So let's jump right in, and the first thing we're going to want to do is create a new level. So let's go to our maps folder, and we can easily create a new level just by right-clicking on our first-person example map and hitting duplicate. We can go ahead and call this our main menu level. And let's double-click on our main menu level to open it. We are going to have to save our main menu level before we can open it. You'll notice that it looks exactly like our first-person example map, and it is. It's an exact duplicate. But let's alter this one by deleting basically everything in the level. We can delete basically all of these boxes here and our characters, our enemies. I'm just going to select all of them. And we can even delete our player start as well. But since our game mode is still the first-person game mode here in the World Settings tab, you may notice that if we play, we'll still spawn in wherever our camera was and we'll spawn in as our player character. And we don't want that to happen since this is going to be our main menu, not the level that we're going to be playing our first-person character as. So what we should do is create a whole new game mode for our main menu level since this is going to be a whole different type of play mode. Let's head over to our blueprints folder and go into our game framework folder. Here we can see our first-person game mode, and we can just create a new game mode by duplicating this one as well. And let's just call it main menu game mode. Let's open that up, and we don't want to spawn in as our player character, so let's just set our HUD to the default and our default pawn class to default. Compile and save. And up here in the world settings, we can select our newly created main menu game mode, or if it's easier, you can just go ahead and drag this way up here to set it as our main menu game mode in this level. But we do know that we're going to want the same player controller for both our main menu and our first-person game mode. So we can go ahead and create a custom player controller to have it available in both of these game modes. The real reason we're going to want a custom player controller though is so we can easily toggle our input mode from UI only to game only for all the widgets that we'll be dealing with in this episode and the next episode. If you don't know what I'm talking about by toggling our input mode, don't worry, you will for sure understand it by the end of this episode. So we can create a custom player controller by right-clicking on the content browser, selecting a new blueprint class, and then create a new player controller. I'm just going to call this PC for player controller Sci-Fi. Let's go ahead and save that so that it doesn't get deleted if our project crashes. And let's just set this player controller for both our first-person game mode. We have our player controller here. Select PC Sci-Fi, compile and save. And our main menu game mode, we have player controller, PC Sci-Fi. Setting the player controller in these game modes doesn't do anything yet, but once we add some scripting to our player controller, that script will be available in both the main menu game mode and the first-person game mode, which is going to be awesome because there are some things that you can only do from a player controller, like changing your input mode. Speaking of which, let's make a function in our player controller that allows us to easily switch input modes from game only to UI only and vice versa. We can open up our PC Sci-Fi just by double clicking on it, and it should look like a normal blueprint. We have the viewport, construction script, and the event graph. On the left hand side, we have the functions option. We can create a new function here, and let's just name it change input mode. We'll be able to call this function from any widget that we create just by getting a reference to our player controller in that widget. But what do we want this function to do? We want it to change our input mode whenever we call it to either UI only or game only based on an input. So we can create an input by adding a new parameter here, and let's just name this game only question mark. And off of the input, we can just do a branch, search for if, plug that right in. Now we have two different executes for this function, so it can do two different things based on whatever we select for our game mode only boolean. Off of the true path, we're going to want to set our input mode to game only. So we can right click, search for set input mode. There's a few different options here, but we're going to want game only. plug that into true. We are going to need to plug in a player controller reference. Luckily, this blueprint is our player controller, so we can just select self and plug that right in. And when we set our input mode, if our mouse cursor is currently showing in game, we're going to want to hide the mouse cursor. So we can right click, search for set show mouse cursor. And we're going to want this to be false, since we don't want to show our mouse cursor whenever our input mode is set to game only. Off of the false path, this is where we're going to want to set our input mode to UI only. So let's right click, search for set input mode to UI only, and plug that into the false path. We can use the same player controller for the input player controller. And when this is called, it's going to want a widget to focus on. We can specify that widget whenever this function's called. So let's create an input for that as well. On the bottom, in mouse lock mode has a few different options. Basically, this determines if you play the game, if your mouse can go outside of these bounds for the viewport. Generally, it doesn't really matter for our purposes, but if you have a smaller widget, you might want to restrict the mouse from going outside of those bounds. And after we set the input mode, we are going to want to show the mouse cursor if the input mode is set to UI. So let's plug this right in and we can change it to true. Now we have this function ready to go, and it'll change our input mode. We'll have a reference to our player controller from any widget that needs to change our input mode, and when the widget calls this function, if the game only input is set to true, it's going to set our input mode to game only, hide the mouse cursor if it's set to false. If this is set to false, it's going to set the input mode to UI only, focus on the widget that we specify, and show the mouse cursor. We're going to see this function in action quite a bit later on when we set up our widgets, but that's really all we have to do to set up our player controller. It might seem like a lot right now, but this is going to save us from scripting the same code in all of our widgets later on, and it's always nice to cut down on redundant scripting. So now let's transition to designing the layout of the background for our main menu. This is going to be everything shown behind the widget blueprint in our main menu. First, we're going to want a camera in our levels, so let's go to place actors, search for a camera, and we can drag it right into our level. With the camera selected, we can go to the details panel, and under auto player activation, let's change it from disabled to player 0, so that when we start playing this level, we'll just always possess this camera. We can hit play, and we'll just be right where this camera is, seeing exactly what it sees. Side note, if you don't want these black bars for your camera, be sure to change constrain aspect ratio to false in the details panel. While you're here, you can also change the field of view or any of the post-processing effects down here. Feel free to go crazy with these settings. You can really get a lot of really stylized shots this way. And you might notice whenever our camera is selected, we're given a little window to show what it sees in the bottom right of the viewport. But if you want to be super specific in placing your camera, what we can do is right-click on the actor and select Pilot Camera Actor. You can pilot just about any actor in your levels by doing this, but when you pilot something, you can move around the level like normal, but you'll be moving the piloted actor at the same time so that the actor's placed exactly where you are in the viewport. But I'm not really sure right now where I want the camera to be placed since I don't have a subject to focus on. So I'm just going to go to my blueprints folder, go to characters, parents, and drop in a BP master FPS character to focus on. And while I'm still piloting my camera, I can move the camera into a nice position. And once I think I have something reasonable, we can just set the camera here. To stop piloting your camera, we can just click on the eject button here on the top left, and that's where our camera is now. I'm not sure if that's perfect placement, but it'll look better once we have a widget on top here. It won't look as empty. We can also alter the position of the camera later on, so don't feel like we're stuck with this position forever. Alright, I think that's good. We have a nice little menu scene. Now we can finally get to work on our actual widget blueprint that will function as our working menu. So let's go to our widgets folder, and let's create a new widget blueprint. We've gone over some of the basics of widgets in this series by now, but this should be a good refresher. Let's just call this widget main menu widget. And we're going to want this widget to be created and added to the viewport at BeginPlay, just like we did with our player heads-up display. But you might be asking, where are we going to create this widget from? Since we don't have a player character or any real actor to add that scripting to. But not to worry, each level comes with its own area to add blueprint scripting. We can just use the level blueprint to make our widget at BeginPlay. And to open the level blueprint, we'll just go to Blueprints here above the viewport, and we can select Open Level Blueprint. Here, we can right-click and search for Event BeginPlay, and off of BeginPlay, we can create a widget. Plug in the executes, and we'll just want to specify the class being the newly created main menu widget. We don't really need a reference to this return value, so we won't need to promote it to a variable, but we will need to add this widget to the viewport, so we can plug that right in. Right now, there's nothing designed in our main menu widget, so if we play, we won't see anything pop up. So the next thing we need to do is add a couple buttons to the main menu widget, and we'll give those buttons a little bit of functionality to open another level or to quit the game. Let's double click on the main menu widget to open it. And to keep things organized, we may want to put these buttons in a vertical box. So we can add a vertical box to our widget first. Compile and save. And we're going to want 3 buttons in total. 1 to start our game, 1 for our settings, and 1 to quit the game. We're not going to add any functionality to the settings button, but the menu kind of looks weird without it, so we're going to add it in there anyways. And to make things easy on ourselves, we can make 1 fully functioning button first and just duplicate it later. We'll make the first button our Start Game button. So let's add a button to our vertical box just by going to our Palette tab, grabbing a button and dropping it into our vertical box. Let's just rename this to something like Start Game Button. And as the name suggests, a button is something that's designed to be clicked on in the widget. Buttons have 3 different appearances, one for their normal state, hovered state, and press state. But to closely match the showcase video, we don't really want the whole button to change color when it's hovered over. In my opinion, it looks kind of better if just the border changes color. So we're going to add an image on top of our button. Now our image is a child of the button. And let's just change this name real fast to Start Game Image. And we can set this image to what it was in the showcase video. So we can go under the Appearance tab, under Brush, Image, just search for our texture, icon Start. And you'll see that the image is all squashed, even though the Start Game button's horizontal and vertical alignment are set to fill. That's because we haven't changed our vertical box to adjusted size based on its content. We can see that that's the problem if we manually adjust the size of our vertical box. So we're just going to want to set size to content to true for our vertical box. And our image looks like it's pretty big. It's stretching out to take just over half of the screen here. So I'm going to adjust the image size. I think I'll change it to something like 900 in the X and 312 in the Y. That looks pretty good to me. Now we can adjust the button so that it more closely resembles the showcase button. Under the normal style, in the showcase, we have like a nice gold or bronze tint. So we can select our tint and just change it to something gold, something around the edge here. And we're going to want a decent padding for our button. Right now, if we added another button, the button will be stacked right below it. Let's just give some nice padding like 10. So everything around the edges of it will be at least 10 pixels away. If you want to adjust the border size, where you can see the gold, we'll just adjust the padding for our image, which I think something small, like maybe 3, will be fine. Now the button's looking pretty good, but if we go back to our button, we'll see a few other parameters that we can change. The only one I'm really concerned with, though, is the hovered sound. We can add a small sound to play whenever our button gets hovered over. But right now, all the sounds we have get kind of annoying. Like if we test out the first-person template fire sound, see that would get kind of annoying, especially if all the buttons were making that same sound every time. But what we can do is quickly alter a sound that we already have into a sound cue. It only takes a minute, but it will add quite a lot of dynamic interaction to the menu. So let's minimize our widget and head over to the audio folder up on the top. This folder's been pretty neglected this whole series, but at least we'll put it into action now. And let's get one of those sounds that we downloaded earlier in the series. You'll see that we have a decent click sound here. And if we right click on this sound, we'll be able to create something called a sound cue. And we'll be able to turn this click sound into something suitable for our menu. And for once, an asset actually has a decent name that we don't have to rename. Let's just double click to open up the sound cue. You can kind of think of a sound cue as a blueprint for sounds. We're not going to dive into too many details here, but look forward to some audio tutorials in the future. With this sound cue, we're only going to need one sound node, and that is going to be a modulator. So let's drag and drop that into our sound cue. We can plug in the output from our click sound into the modulator and take the output of the modulator into our sound cue output. A modulator is a node that simply alters the sound pitch and volume within a certain range. Let's listen to the modulated sound just by going up here and clicking on play cue. If you click it over and over, you'll notice slight variations in the sound. I mean, I can barely hear this change since it's so small. If you click on the modulator, you'll be able to see all of its parameters here on the left side in the details panel. What I'm going to do is change its pitch min and pitch max both to 2 so that its pitch is going to be really high. And I'm going to change its volume range from 0.5 to 0.7. This is going to keep the exact same tone every single time that this sound cue is played, but the slight variation in volume helps the sound not get old as quickly. Be sure to save this sound cue, and with this sound cue created, we're able to go back to our main menu widget, select the Start Game button, and we can select that cue here for our hovered sound. Now if we play in the editor, we can listen to that sound over and over. And it doesn't sound too bad. It kind of sounds like a normal sci-fi sound. And that's awesome. So our button design is now complete. We just need to copy our button twice to make the 2 other buttons. So let's open up our main menu widget and we can duplicate our Start Game button. I'm just going to duplicate it. And we can rename the second button to something like Settings button and the image to something like Settings image. While we're here, we might as well change the image that the settings image is showing. Just search for icon settings and be sure to change the size again to something like 900, 312. The same as our other image. Now we can duplicate the settings button, change the name to Quit button, and change this name to Quit image. While we're here, we might as well change this image. I think the icon is called Exit Game, and 900, 312. Compile and save. Everything's looking really good. I just want to place the vertical box more near the middle. It's kind of just anchored to the top left right now, so let's anchor it to the left center. We can change its position Y to 0 and change its pivot point to 0.5 just so it's right in the middle. And then let's move it away just from this far left edge. We can change its position X to something like 110 just so it's not right on the left side. There we go. Let's see how that looks. Not too bad. I'm just going to move the camera really quick by piloting it. Maybe a little closer to my actor. There we go. And that's awesome. Now our visuals are complete, but none of our buttons really do anything at all since we haven't set up any functionality for them. Luckily, setting up their functionality is going to be really quick. We're just going to want our Start Game button to open up the first-person example map and our Exit Game button to quit the game. So let's exit this and go back to our main menu widget. And we can go into our event graph to do all the scripting for this. We can delete event pre-construct and event tick since we won't be needing those, but we will need event construct. Here's where all the work we did earlier in the video in our player controller pays off. If we play in the editor and click anywhere other than our buttons, you'll notice that our mouse disappears and we can't select anything. The game kind of just freezes. That's because we're in the wrong input mode right now. The game doesn't know that we're supposed to be interacting with our widget. It just thinks we're hanging out as a camera actor and have a widget on screen. So what we can do to fix that is at event construct, we can get our player controller. Let's cast to our player controller Sci-Fi, the custom one that we made earlier. And let's promote this output to a variable. Let's just rename this player controller. We're going to need a reference to this later on as well. And off of our player controller, we can just search for change input mode, the function that we created earlier. And at BeginPlay, we want our input mode to be UI only, since we're going to be interacting with a user interface. So we'll leave this game only to false, since if you remember, the false path in this function changes our input mode into UI only. And what widget are we going to want this function to focus on? Well, our main menu widget, which is the one that we're currently editing, so we can just select self and plug that right in. If you compile and save, minimize, and play in the editor, Now we can click wherever we want, and the game knows that we're meant to be interacting with our main menu widget. You might want to get used to changing input modes because we're going to be doing that a lot in the next video as well. Now let's set up our start button. We can click on the start game button here, and in the details panel we have all of the start button's events. Let's just get the on pressed event for our start button. And whenever we press this button, we're going to want to open a level, so we can right click and search for open level by name. Plug that right into the execute. We're going to need to spell out the level name that we want to open, and it needs to be spelled out exactly how it's spelled out in our content browser. Otherwise the game will just crash and give us an error. So to show that for you, I'm just going to go to our maps folder. We can copy the name exactly, or you can just spell it out here. I just want to make sure I don't get it wrong. And with that hooked up, we can play in the editor, select start game, and you'll notice immediately that you can't really do anything. That's because we're still in UI only input mode. So we have to change our input mode back from UI only to game only before we open our level. Let's go back to our event graph. So let's change our input mode before we open our new level. Let's plug in a copy of our change input mode. We are going to need another reference to our player controller. And this time we will want to set our input mode to game only, so let's set this boolean to true. If you compile and save, we can go and play in the editor, click on start game, and now everything is working as normal. Perfect, so we have a working start button that sets the correct input mode and then opens the specified level. Lastly, we're just going to want our quit button to exit the game when it's pressed, so we can select our quit button, get the on pressed event, and actually on another side note, if you don't know the difference between event pressed and event clicked, let me show you really fast with the start game button. If I disconnect on press and plugged in on clicked with our start game button, let's play in the editor. And I can press down on start game but cancel my click if I drag off of the start game button. That's how on clicked works. You have a chance to click and release to actually select the button, fire that event, or you can cancel your selection by dragging off of the button. You don't really have that option if you use event on pressed. So we can delete on clicked. And now as soon as my mouse button goes down, that's when the button will be pressed. So all of the functionality after event on pressed will happen as soon as my mouse button goes down. On clicked is a little more lenient. So that's the difference between on pressed and on clicked. It's small, but I thought I should mention it. Anyways, back to our quit button. For the quit button's event on pressed, we just want to call the function quit game. So we can right click, search for quit game, and plug that right in. And that's going to work just the way you think it would. As soon as you press the quit button, the game is going to quit. So we can minimize and play, click on exit game, and the game just ends. And with that done, our main menu widget is now complete. I know it seemed like a lot, but most of it was just designer elements to make the menu look good and feel just a little bit better. Before we end the video, let's go into our project settings though, because there's one thing that I want to change. We can go into our maps and modes, and you'll see our editor startup map and our game default map. The editor startup map is the map that opens up by default when we load our project in the Unreal Editor. I'm just going to leave that one as our first person example map. But the game default map is the map that opens up when the game is launched after it's been fully packaged. This one I'm going to change from the first person example map to our main menu level, so that if we package the game right now, the game would open up with the correct main menu level. And we can just exit out of that, save all, and okay, that puts us in a great place to end the video. Thank you for following along and hopefully learning something. In the next video, we'll finish our game over events, both when we beat the game and when we lose the game. It'll likely be our last blueprint focused video in the series, so hopefully you're excited. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps out against the YouTube algorithm. I'm Joe Von D, here to help you think like a game developer. Stay tuned for the next video in the first-person shooter tutorial series.